The first thing Elias Mercer learned that night was that some wounds speak before people do. Rain beat hard on the tin roof of his cabin, steady as 1,000 small fingers tapping from the dark, while the woman on his table tried not to tremble. She had come out of the storm half an hour before, or maybe the storm had carried her there, leaving her against his fence like something the world had thrown away and expected the dirt to keep. Apache, he knew that much from the beadwork at her collar, from the way her dark hair clung to her cheek, from the quiet strength in her eyes, even when fever had taken most of the strength from her body. Elias had seen fear before. Men in saloons wore it loud. Lawmen hid it behind badges. But hers was different. It did not beg. It watched. He moved slowly, because a lonely man who had buried too much learned that haste could sound like cruelty, even when the hands meant kindness. The lantern beside them hissed softly, throwing gold over the rough pine walls, the cold stove, the old cradle in the corner covered by a flour sack, and 12 years of dust. Elias did not look at it. He had taught himself not to. On the table, the woman pressed one hand against her side, breathing shallow, her eyes following every inch of his movement. He held a clean cloth in one hand and a little brown bottle of carbolic in the other. Not much medicine, not enough for a doctor, but better than rainwater and prayer. "I need to clean it," he said, his voice low, worn down by years of speaking mostly to horses. "I won't do more than you allow." She did not answer. Outside, thunder rolled over the valley, and for a moment the whole cabin seemed to hold its breath. Elias set the bottle down, rolled up his sleeves, and reached toward the torn cloth near her ribs, careful as a man approaching a skittish mare. His fingers had not yet touched skin. They only came close enough for her to feel the warmth of another human hand. That was when her eyes widened. Her breath caught sharp, and in a voice so small it almost disappeared beneath the rain, she whispered, "Don't, it still hurts there." Elias stopped, not because she had spoken, but because of how she had spoken. There was pain in it, yes, but not the kind a bandage could answer. His hand froze in the lantern light, inches from her side, and he saw then what he had missed before, an older mark near her shoulder, pale against brown skin, a memory the body had kept even after time tried to bury it. He lowered his hand, slowly, no shame in his face, no question pushing at her, only silence, the kind a decent man offers when words would step too hard. "All right," he said, "then I won't touch there." The woman stared at him as if he had done something impossible, as if men in his shape, with his skin, in cabins like this, did not usually stop when told. Elias picked up the cloth and placed it beside her hand instead of taking charge of it himself. "You tell me where," he said. "I'll follow." Her fingers tightened around the edge of the table. The rain kept falling. The old cradle sat in the corner like a ghost that had forgotten how to leave. And between a white cowboy who had lost his family and an Apache woman who had learned not to trust mercy, something quiet entered the room. Not trust, not yet, but the first small space where trust might one day stand. 3 hours before the rain carried Ayanna Red Willow to Elias Mercer's fence, the town of Bitter Creek had already decided what kind of woman she was. The decision did not take evidence. It did not take patience. It only took dust, fear, and the color of her skin. She had been brought down the main street just after sundown, walking between two deputies who held her arms as if the whole territory might fall apart if they let go. Her dress was torn from travel, her boots were caked with red mud, and her face held the stillness of someone saving her strength for a worse hour. Storefront lamps flickered to life one by one. Curtains moved. Men stepped out from the mercantile, from the livery, from the saloon with their hats low and their opinions already loaded. Nobody asked her name. Nobody asked where she had been found. They looked at her Apache beadwork and made a full story out of it. Marshal Rusk stood on the jailhouse steps with his thumbs hooked in his belt, letting the crowd gather close enough to feel important. He had a clean gray coat, polished boots, and the kind of smile that never reached the soul. Beside him, 3 mine owners watched without speaking. They smelled of cigar smoke, wet wool, and money that had crossed too many dirty hands. Rusk lifted one paper in the air and told the town she had been seen near a freight wagon before it disappeared by Cottonwood, Washington. He said she was dangerous. He said she was likely a scout. He said every decent family in Bitter Creek ought to sleep easier once she was behind a locked door. Ayanna did not answer him. That angered them more than any speech could have. Silence has a way of making small men feel judged. Elias had been standing outside the blacksmith shop, waiting on a new shoe for his horse, his collar turned up against the wind. He had come to town only for coffee, nails, and kerosene. He had not come for trouble. A man living alone 12 miles beyond the last fence learns to keep his eyes down and his business narrow. But then Ayanna stumbled near the jail steps, and one deputy jerked her upright too quickly. Not enough to make a spectacle, just enough to show the town who had power. Elias saw her wince and press one hand to her side. He also saw the dark spot beneath her fingers, spreading slow. Rusk saw it too and pretended not to. The marshal nodded toward the back of the jail. "Put her in the storage room until morning," he said. "Cold will keep her quiet." That was when Elias moved. Not fast, not dramatic. He simply walked through the crowd until his shadow fell across the steps. The voices thinned around him. Folks in Bitter Creek knew Elias Mercer. They knew the burned-out grief behind his eyes. They knew he had not raised his voice in years. He took off his canvas coat and placed it over Ayanna's shoulders without touching her skin. The gesture was so plain that nobody knew how to answer it. Rusk tilted his head. "You interfering with the law, Mercer?" Elias looked at the paper in the marshal's hand, then at the woman swaying beneath his coat. "No," he said. "I am interfering with the cold." A few men muttered. One laughed too loudly and stopped when Elias turned his eyes on him. Ayanna looked up then, just once. Not grateful, not trusting, only surprised that a white man had covered her before accusing her. Rusk stepped closer, his smile tightening at the corners. "Best ride home, Elias. This does not concern you." The wind pushed dust along the boards between them. Elias heard the old town clock strike 7. He thought of his empty cabin, the dead stove, the cradle under the flour sack, the long road home where no voice waited. Then he saw Ayanna's knees bend, just a little, as her strength gave way under the weight of everyone's judgment. He caught the coat before it slipped from her shoulders, still careful not to touch more than he had to. "She needs a doctor," he said. Rusk glanced at the crowd. "Doctor is out at Miller's place." "Then she needs shelter." "She has shelter." Elias looked past him toward the storage room behind the jail, where frost had already silvered the window from the inside. His voice dropped lower. "That is not shelter. That is a box." For one breath, nobody moved. Then Ayanna whispered something in Apache that Elias did not understand, but he understood the shame in Rusk's face when the mine owners looked away. The marshal had built his authority on people being afraid to question him in public. Elias had not questioned him loudly. That made it worse. Quiet truth carries farther than shouting in a town that knows it is lying. Rusk finally stepped aside, not because mercy had touched him, but because witnesses had. "Take her then," he said. "But when morning comes, I will be at your ranch." Elias nodded once. "Road is 12 miles. Bring a warm coat." And with the whole town watching, he led his horse forward, helped Ayanna climb into the saddle only after she gave the faintest nod, and walked beside her into the rain that had begun to fall from the black western sky. By the time Elias Mercer and Ayanna Red Willow reached the old ranch, the rain had turned the road into black ribbon and washed every hoofprint behind them clean. That was the only mercy the weather offered. Elias walked the last mile with one hand on the bridle and the other held open at his side, never reaching for Ayanna unless she asked, never crowding the space around her tired body. She sat stiff in the saddle beneath his canvas coat, her face pale in the breaks of lightning, her eyes fixed on the empty dark ahead as if she expected the land itself to betray her. The Mercer place appeared slowly, first as a deeper shadow beyond the cottonwoods, then as a low cabin with a sagging porch, a barn leaning into the wind, and one lantern burning in the front window because Elias had left it there that morning without knowing why. The place looked less like a home than a memory that refused to fall down. He tied the horse beneath the awning and stepped back. "You can come down when you are ready," he said. Ayanna looked at him through wet strands of hair. "Most men would pull me down." Elias glanced toward the barn, where rain drummed soft against old shingles. "Most men talk too much about what they would do." That almost changed her expression. Not a smile, not even close, but something in her jaw loosened, as if the answer had not landed where she expected. She swung one leg over the saddle and lowered herself slowly, one hand pressed to her side. Pain made her breath shorten, but pride kept her upright. Elias saw both and respected both. He opened the cabin door and stood aside. Warmth did not greet them. The stove was cold, the air smelled of dust, leather, pine smoke long gone, and the kind of loneliness that settles into wood after too many winters. Ayanna stepped inside and stopped. Her eyes moved across the room with the sharp care of someone reading danger in ordinary things. Rifle over the mantel. Wash basin near the stove. Table by the wall. 2 chairs. 1 bedroll folded near the hearth. The old cradle in the corner, covered by a flour sack. Elias saw her notice it. He looked away first. "You can have the table," he said. "It is steadier than the bed. I did not ask for your bed. I did not offer it for comfort." She turned then, and for the first time her eyes held something besides suspicion. A question, maybe, or the start of one. Elias moved to the stove, fed it kindling, and struck a match. The little flame caught, trembled, and became orange light. He filled a tin cup from the water bucket and set it on the floor halfway between them instead of placing it in her hand. She stared at the cup. "Why there?" "Because you may not want me close." Outside, thunder walked over the hills. Inside, the stove began to tick as heat returned to iron. Ayanna crossed the room with careful steps, picked up the cup, and drank as if every swallow had to pass through pain before it reached her throat. Elias opened a small wooden box near the shelf and took out clean cloth, a needle, thread, and the brown bottle. She stiffened when she saw them. He noticed. He set each item down one at a time, slow enough for her to name the danger herself if she needed to. "I was married once," he said quietly, surprising both of them. Ayanna said nothing. Elias kept his eyes on the cloth. "My wife used to say a hurt person should be asked before being helped. Said pain takes enough without folks stealing the rest." The fire cracked once in the stove. Ayanna looked toward the covered cradle, then back at his hands. "Where is she now?" Elias folded the cloth with more care than it needed. "Buried west of the barn. With our boy." The cabin went still around that truth. Even the rain seemed to soften against the roof. Ayanna lowered her eyes, not in pity, but in respect. That mattered more. "Then you know," she said. Elias lifted his gaze. "Know what?" She touched the edge of the table to steady herself, her voice low as smoke. "That some places on the body are not where the hurting lies." Elias did not answer right away. He only pulled the second chair back and sat down across the room, leaving the medicine untouched between them. The law could ride 12 miles by morning. Marshal Rusk could bring every lie Bitter Creek had ever believed. But for that one rain-soaked hour, in a cabin held together by grief and stubborn timber, Elias Mercer did the one thing nobody in town had done for Ayanna Redwillow. He waited. Ayanna waited until the stove had warmed the room before she reached for the cloth. Not because the pain had softened, but because Elias Mercer had not tried to own it. That made the cabin feel stranger than the jail, stranger than the street, stranger than the eyes of Bitter Creek pressing judgment into her skin. He sat across from her with his hands folded between his knees, looking at the floorboards where rainwater had dripped from his coat and made dark little islands in the dust. The medicine lay untouched on the table. The needle, too. The thread. The clean cloth. All of it waiting like a question. At last, Ayanna picked up the cloth and pressed it near her side, not directly on the wound, only close enough to test whether her courage would hold. Her breath shook once. Elias heard it, but did not move. That was the hardest kindness he had ever practiced. A horseman knew how to rope a steer, mend a fence, pull a wagon from mud. Waiting for another soul to open its own door was a different kind of strength, and it left a man feeling useless in the hands. "You were not afraid of the marshal," Ayanna said. Elias looked up. "I was. You did not show it. That is not the same thing." She studied him in the firelight. His face was weathered, lined by sun and loss, but there was no hunger in his eyes, no need to be praised for what he had done. That unsettled her more than danger would have. Dangerous men were easy to understand. They always wanted something. Elias seemed to want nothing except for the room to stop hurting her. "Why help me?" she asked. "You do not know me." He leaned back, and the chair gave a tired wooden groan. "I knew enough. You knew Apache. I knew wounded." Her fingers paused on the cloth. Outside, the rain shifted with the wind, brushing the cabin walls like long grass against a grave marker. Ayanna looked toward the covered cradle again. She wished she had not. Some objects carried too much silence. "In my people," she said, We do not step over grief without asking permission. Elias followed her gaze, and for a moment the old room changed around him. He saw a woman laughing near the stove, a boy with dark curls trying to stand beside that cradle. Morning light before fever took the color out of everything. Then the vision left, and only the flour sack remained. Then do not ask, he said gently. Not tonight. Ayanna nodded. Respect passed between them, quiet and thin as thread, but real. She opened the torn edge of her sleeve enough to reach a bruise near her upper arm and cleaned it herself with the water first. Elias watched the floor. When she needed the bottle, she held out her hand. He stood slowly, took 2 steps, and placed it within reach. Not in her palm. Beside her. She gave him a look that said she had noticed. Who taught you to step back? She asked. A woman who got tired of men stepping forward. Ayanna almost smiled, but pain caught it before it reached her mouth. Your wife. Yes. She was wise. Wiser than the town deserved. The words hung there, and with them came a softer grief, the kind that did not ask to be comforted. Ayanna uncorked the bottle and touched a little of the medicine to the cloth. The sharp smell filled the cabin. She closed her eyes and pressed it carefully to the wound she could bear to reach. A faint sound escaped her, not loud, not weak, only human. Elias turned his head toward the rain and let her keep that moment private. Then, from beyond the cabin, through the weather and the blackness, came the distant sound of a horse stumbling over wet ground. Ayanna's eyes opened. Elias rose without hurry, though every part of him went still. He crossed to the window and lifted the burlap curtain with 2 fingers. Far down the muddy road, a lantern swung once, vanished behind rain, then appeared again. Not morning, not the marshal yet. Someone else was riding hard toward the Mercer place, and whoever it was knew exactly where to find them. The rider reached the yard with the kind of urgency that made even the horses in the barn stir against their stalls. Elias kept the curtain raised just enough to watch the lantern swing beneath a dripping hand, then lowered it before the rider could see movement inside. Ayanna had already shifted from the table, one hand braced against the wood, her face tightened by pain and old habit. She was looking for a place to hide before Elias even turned around. That told him more than words would have. Stay where the fire is warm, he said. If I run, I may live, she answered. If you run now, you may fall before the creek. She hated that he was right. Pride could hold a body upright for a while, but fever was a patient enemy. Elias crossed to the mantel and took down the rifle, not pointing it, not cocking it, only carrying it low as a man carries a tool he hopes not to use. At the door, he paused and looked back. Ayanna had one hand under the folded edge of his coat where a small knife waited. He saw it. She saw him see it. Neither of them spoke of it. Outside, the rain had thinned to a cold mist. The rider sat hunched in the saddle near the porch, hat pulled low, shoulders narrow beneath a soaked wool coat. Not a lawman. Too small for Rusk. Too frightened to be one of his deputies. Mercer, the rider called, voice cracking. Elias stepped onto the porch. That is far enough. The rider lifted his face. It was Thomas Vale, the young telegraph clerk from Bitter Creek, barely 20, with ink usually on his cuffs and worry usually in his eyes. Tonight he had both, and something worse besides. Marshal Rusk sent men to the East Road, Thomas said. Not at dawn. Now. He told folks you stole a prisoner. Elias felt the cold settle deeper. Why are you telling me? Thomas looked past him toward the cabin door, though he could not see inside. Because she did not do what they said. The words landed soft, but they changed the shape of the night. Behind Elias, the floorboard near the door gave the faintest sound. Ayanna had come close enough to hear. Thomas swallowed hard and reached into his coat, then froze when Elias shifted the rifle. Slowly, carefully, the boy pulled out a folded paper wrapped in oilcloth. I work the telegraph office. I heard them talking behind the freight room. Rusk and Mr. Cargill from the mine. They were waiting on a message from Fort Bowie, but this came first from the land office in Tucson. I copied it before they burned the original. Elias did not step down. What is it? Thomas held it out with a shaking hand. A survey order. Cottonwood Wash, Red Willow Spring, all of it. They want the Apache blamed so no one questions the claim. For the first time, Ayanna spoke from the dark doorway behind Elias. Red Willow Spring is not theirs. Thomas flinched at her voice, then lowered his eyes as if shame had weight. No, ma'am, it is not. Elias took the oilcloth and opened it beneath the porch lantern. The writing was blurred at the edges, but clear enough where it mattered. Names. Boundaries. A company seal. Gideon Rusk listed as witness. Cargill Mining listed as beneficiary. Not law. A theft dressed in paper. Ayanna gripped the doorframe, and the look on her face was not surprise. It was the tired sorrow of someone seeing a lie finally put into English. I saw that map, she said. In the freight office. That is why they followed me. Elias looked at Thomas. Does anyone else know? Only me. And now you. The road beyond the yard gave a wet crunch. Then another. Hooves, more than one, moving slow without lanterns. Thomas heard them too, and all the color left his face. Elias folded the paper once and tucked it inside his vest. Get in the barn, he said. Do not light anything. Thomas slid from the saddle and hurried into the dark. Elias turned back to Ayanna. The firelight touched one side of her face, leaving the other in shadow. She looked weaker than she wanted to be and braver than any town deserved. They will say you hid me because I bewitched you, she said. Elias almost laughed, but the night was too heavy for it. Bitter Creek has said dumber things. You could still hand me over. I could. You could live quiet again. At that, Elias looked toward the covered cradle in the corner behind her, toward the life that had already gone quiet forever. Then he stepped inside, set the rifle beside the door, and moved the chair beneath the latch without haste. Quiet is not the same as peace, he said. Outside, the unseen riders stopped at the edge of the yard, and the old Mercer cabin held its breath again. The riders outside did not call out at first. They let the silence do the work men often ask guns to do, pressing it against the walls, pushing it under the door, making every small sound inside the cabin feel guilty. Elias Mercer stood with one hand resting on the back of the chair he had wedged beneath the latch. He could hear 3 horses, maybe 4, shifting in the mud near the yard gate. Not close enough for a rush. Close enough for a warning. Ayanna Red Willow sat near the stove now, wrapped in his canvas coat, her face damp with fever and firelight. The oilcloth paper lay hidden inside Elias's vest, but its weight seemed to fill the room. A theft dressed as law. A spring dressed as property. A woman dressed as guilt because powerful men needed her to be. From the porch came Marshal Gideon Rusk's voice, smooth as a knife handle worn by use. Mercer, you have had your hour of charity. Open the door. Elias did not answer right away. He looked at Ayanna first, not for permission to defend her, for the truth of what fear was doing to her body. Her eyes were steady, but her fingers had closed around the blue cloth at her waist, the one she had used earlier to bind what she could reach. In the better light, Elias saw the stitching along its edge. A thunderbird worked in faded blue thread, careful and old. Something moved in his memory. His mother's Bible. A pressed scrap of cloth between the pages. A note written in her thin hand after the fever years. He turned slowly toward the shelf by the bedroll. What are you doing? Ayanna whispered. Remembering wrong, Elias said. Rusk knocked once, hard enough to shake dust from the lintel. Do not make me come in after you. Elias took the Bible from the shelf. The leather cover was cracked, the corners soft from hands that had prayed over it when prayers were all they could afford. He opened it near the middle, past a lock of brown hair, past a dried prairie flower, to a folded note and a small piece of blue cloth pressed flat by years. The same stitching, the same bird. Ayanna stared at it, as if the room had shifted beneath her. Elias unfolded the note. His mother's words crossed the page in faded ink. He read them once in silence, then again aloud. Not for Rusk, not for the men outside, but for the woman by the stove. To the Red Willow woman who found me near the wash and carried me through fever, I owe the breath of my son. The rain tapped softly at the window. Ayanna's lips parted, but no words came. Elias looked at the cloth in the Bible, then at the cloth in her hand. My mother said an Apache woman saved her before I was born. I thought it was just one of her stories. Ayanna touched the thunderbird at her waist. My grandmother carried a white woman through the desert. She said the woman kept asking for the child inside her to live. Elias swallowed. The cabin seemed smaller now, not from danger, but from the closeness of lives that had touched long before either of them had names for it. Outside, Rusk's patience thinned. Last warning, Mercer. Elias closed the Bible gently. He did not reach for the rifle. He did not raise his voice. He walked to the door and stood behind it, the chair still holding firm beneath the latch. "There is a boy in my barn," he called out. "Telegraph clerk. He brought a copy of your survey order." The yard went still. Even the horses seemed to stop breathing. Elias continued, each word plain, each word heavy. "It has your name on it. Cargill Mining 2. Red Willow Spring. Cottonwood, Washington. All of it." No answer came from the porch. That was answer enough. Ayanna watched Elias's back, the broad shape of a man standing between her and the weather of other men's lies. She had seen courage before. Loud courage. Painted courage. Courage that sang before battle and shook the ground with drums. This was different. This was a quiet thing in a wooden cabin. A man with grief behind him, danger before him, and nothing in his hands but the truth. Then Rusk spoke again, softer now, colder. "Paper burns, Mercer." Elias looked down at the Bible in his hand, then toward Ayanna, and for the first time that night, something like anger entered his eyes. Not wild, not reckless, clean. "Some debts do not," he said. And on the hill beyond the yard, where the rain had begun to lift, a line of dark figures appeared between the cottonwoods, sitting straight on horses without lanterns, watching the cabin in perfect silence. The figures on the hill did not move like a mob. They moved like memory returning to a place that had tried to forget it. One by one, the riders came into the gray edge of moonlight, not rushing, not shouting, not carrying anger in their hands. Their horses stepped through wet grass with a patience that made the men near the porch uneasy. Marshal Gideon Rusk turned from the cabin door and stared up at them, his face half hidden beneath his hat brim. Elias Mercer watched through the side window while Ayanna Red Willow stood behind him, one hand pressed to the table, the other closed around the blue cloth at her waist. Fever had left her weak, but the sight of those riders put something upright in her that medicine had not touched. "My people," she whispered. Elias did not ask if they had come for him. He already knew the answer was more complicated than that. At the front of the line sat an older Apache man with silver woven through his braids and a red blanket over his shoulders, darkened by rain. He raised one hand, palm open. The gesture was not surrender. It was command without noise. Rusk looked back toward his deputies, and for the first time that night, the law on his chest seemed smaller than the silence around him. "This is United States territory," Rusk called. The old man did not answer. He only dismounted. Two others followed, then another, until more than 40 Apaches stood along the ridge and down through the cottonwoods, their faces calm, their eyes fixed on the cabin, the porch, the marshal, and the lie between them. Thomas Vale slipped from the barn shadows holding his soaked hat in both hands. He looked terrified, but he walked anyway. That kind of courage often shakes, and it is still courage. "Marshal," Thomas said, his voice thin in the damp air. "I sent a wire before I came here." Rusk turned slowly. "You did what?" "To the territorial judge in Tucson. And to Fort Bowie." Thomas swallowed hard. "I copied the survey order. I copied the names." The mine owner Cargill, standing near the gate in a long black coat, stepped back as if the mud had opened beneath his boots. Elias saw it. So did Ayanna. Guilt has a way of moving before the mouth does. Rusk smiled then, but it was the brittle kind, the kind that breaks from the inside. "Boy, you have no idea what you have stepped into." The old Apache man finally spoke, his English slow but clear. He stepped into truth. Ayanna's breath caught. "Grandfather," she said, soft enough that only Elias heard. The old man's eyes turned toward the cabin window, and the hard lines in his face changed. Not much, just enough. The look of a man who had followed a blood trail of worry through 12 miles of rain and found the one he feared losing still alive. Elias opened the door. The chair scraped softly as he moved it aside. He stepped onto the porch with the Bible in one hand and the folded survey copy in the other. Rusk's deputies shifted, but no one reached for anything. There were too many witnesses now. Too much silence. Elias held up the Bible first. "My mother wrote the name Red Willow in this book before I drew my first breath." Then he held up the survey paper. Marshal Rusk wrote it again for a different reason. The words settled over the yard, plain as frost on a fence rail. Ayanna came to the doorway behind him, still wrapped in his coat. She did not hide. She looked at the men who had called her dangerous, then at her grandfather, then at Elias. "They wanted our spring," she said. Her voice was quiet, but it carried. "So they made my face into their proof." No one answered. Not Rusk. Not Cargill. Not the deputies who had held her in the street. From far off, thunder rolled one last time beyond the hills, tired now, moving away. The old Apache man stepped forward and placed a small bundle on the wet porch boards. Inside was an older map, protected in oiled hide, marked with signatures, seals, and a boundary line that bent around Red Willow Spring like even paper new to show respect. Elias looked at it, then at Rusk. The marshal's face had gone pale beneath the rain. "Paper burns," Elias said quietly, repeating the threat back to him. Then he touched the Bible with 2 fingers. But not when enough honest hands hold copies. And in that yard, with no shot fired and no man boasting, the story Bitter Creek had told about Ayanna Red Willow began to fall apart under its own weight. By morning, Bitter Creek could no longer pretend it had mistaken fear for justice by accident. The town gathered outside the courthouse under a sky rinsed clean by rain, its boardwalks dark, its hitching rails dripping, its windows full of faces that had watched Ayanna Red Willow dragged through the street the night before and now did not know where to place their eyes. Marshal Gideon Rusk stood on the steps without his easy smile. Cargill and the other mine men stood apart from him, close enough to share blame, far enough to deny friendship. Elias Mercer arrived on horseback beside Ayanna's grandfather, with Thomas Vale walking behind them, carrying the copied wire and the survey order in a leather satchel held tight against his chest. Ayanna rode in the wagon, not because she could not stand, but because Elias had insisted that pride did not have to spend itself all at once. His canvas coat still lay over her shoulders. She had not given it back. When they stopped before the courthouse, the crowd parted without being asked. That parting did not feel like respect yet. It felt like shame learning how to move. The territorial judge had ridden through the night from the relay station, a thin gray man with spectacles and mud on his cuffs. He took the papers from Thomas, took the older map from Ayanna's grandfather, and read them while the whole street held its breath. No one shouted. No one dared. The only sounds were horses shifting, a sign creaking above the mercantile, and the slow turn of paper in the judge's hands. At last, he looked at Rusk. This woman was detained on a false accusation. Rusk opened his mouth, but the judge kept speaking. The claim filed by Cargill Mining is suspended pending inquiry. The spring remains under prior protection. The words were plain, dry, legal, but they rolled down the courthouse steps like water finding the lowest ground. Ayanna looked at the people who had called her guilty before knowing her name. Some looked away. One woman near the dressmaker's shop began to cry softly, not from grief, but from the discomfort of seeing herself clearly. Elias stood beside the wagon with one hand resting on the wheel. He did not look proud. Pride would have made the moment smaller. He looked tired, as if doing the decent thing had cost him exactly what he had expected, and he had paid it anyway. Rusk was ordered to surrender his badge until the inquiry was finished. When the judge held out his hand, Rusk hesitated. For one breath, the old reflex of power tried to remain standing. Then he unpinned the badge and placed it in the judge's palm. The sound was small, metal touching skin, yet half the town heard their own silence inside it. Cargill protested first, then stopped when Thomas lifted the satchel. More copies, more witnesses, more truth than any fire could erase. Ayanna's grandfather stepped to the wagon and spoke to her in Apache. Elias did not understand the words, but he understood the tenderness beneath them. Ayanna answered, then looked toward him. He says a man who stands in a doorway without hatred is harder to find than water in dry country. Elias lowered his eyes. Tell him I was scared. She did, and the old man listened, then gave a low sound that might have been approval. He says only fools think courage is the absence of fear. The judge cleared his throat and asked if Ayanna wished to make a formal complaint against the town. Everyone waited for her anger. They had earned it. She looked down Main Street, at the saloon, the jail, the storage room window silvered now by morning frost. Then she touched the blue cloth at her waist. I want the doctor sent to Red Willow Spring, she said. There are children sick from the cold. The judge blinked. So did half the crowd. She could have asked for punishment. She asked for medicine. Elias felt something shift in the street then, quieter than forgiveness and heavier than apology. Ayanna turned to him and held out his coat. He reached for it, but she did not let go right away. Their hands met over the worn canvas, brown and white against the same faded cloth. This time, she did not pull back. Neither did he. Around them, Bitter Creek stood in the thin morning light, learning too late that mercy was not weakness. It was judgment of another kind. Red Willow Spring lay 18 miles west of Bitter Creek, where the land opened into pale grass, sandstone, and cottonwoods that leaned over clear water like old guardians. By the time the wagon reached it, the sun had climbed high enough to turn every wet leaf silver. The Apache camp had been waiting, but not with war cries, not with raised hands, not with the anger Bitter Creek feared because it had earned it. They waited in silence. Women came forward first to help unload medicine. Children watched from behind blankets and horse legs. An old healer touched Ayanna's face, then looked past her at Elias Mercer, measuring him in the careful way of people who had survived too many promises. Elias did not step forward. He did not ask for thanks. He took crates from the wagon and placed them where he was shown. Flour, coffee, bandages, fever tonic from the town doctor, who had ridden out with his eyes low and his hat in his hands. No one spoke much. That suited the day. Some truths need quiet around them before they can settle. Ayanna moved slowly through her people, receiving soft words, a touch to her shoulder, a blanket folded around her with more care than any court could offer. Elias watched from near the wagon wheel. She belonged here in a way he had never belonged to Bitter Creek, not even before grief made him a stranger. He thought that would hurt. It did, but not sharply. More like cold air entering a room that had been shut too long. Her grandfather approached him near the spring and held out the small blue cloth from Elias's mother's Bible. Elias had not noticed when the old man took it. The Thunderbird's stitching looked brighter in daylight. "This was kept by your mother," the old man said. "Now it has found its road back." Elias took it carefully. "Your wife kept my daughter's child alive last night," the old man continued. "My mother kept yours alive long ago. The dead is not one line. It is a circle." Elias looked toward Ayanna. She was kneeling beside a child wrapped in a wool blanket, showing the girl how to drink the tonic slowly. Her face still carried pain, but something in it had eased. "I did not know I was paying anything back," Elias said. "Good," the old man answered. "Then it was mercy, not trade." Late that afternoon, Elias prepared to leave before anyone could ask him to stay or tell him he should not. He tightened the cinch on his saddle while the spring murmured behind him and the camp moved with the low music of living. Ayanna came to him carrying his canvas coat folded over both arms. The coat had dried stiff from rain and road dust. "You keep leaving this with me," she said. "Seems it knows where it is needed better than I do." She looked down at the worn fabric, then at his hands, those careful hands that had learned to stop. "The town will not love you for what you did. The town has never been good at love. And your ranch. It will be quiet." Ayanna nodded, and for a moment that quiet waited between them, neither promise nor farewell. She reached into her pouch and took out the blue cloth from her own waist, the one with the same Thunderbird, the one she had held through fever and fear. She tied it around his saddle horn. "Not as a claim, not as a debt, as a remembrance. So the road knows you," she said. Elias touched the knot once. "Will you be all right?" Ayanna looked toward the spring, then toward Bitter Creek far beyond the hills. Not all at once. The honesty of it stayed with him. Healing was not a door opening. It was a trail found step by step, sometimes in darkness, sometimes with someone walking far enough beside you to prove the world had not gone empty. Elias mounted, but before he turned the horse, Ayanna stepped closer and placed her hand briefly over his. No fear, no flinch, just warmth, light as a bird landing on a fence rail. Then she let go. Elias rode east as the sun dropped low, and behind him Red Willow Spring caught the evening gold. By sundown, the town of Bitter Creek had heard the story in pieces. A marshal without a badge, a mining claim suspended, a white cowboy who stood for an Apache woman and never fired a shot. Some called him foolish. Some called her lucky. But out past the cottonwoods, where water kept singing over stone, the truth was simpler than any of them knew. A wound had been seen without being owned. A hand had stopped when asked. And somewhere between two peoples taught to fear each other, mercy